because I know people. Right. So everybody able to see the screen?
Yes, but you.
Yeah. Let me just
reset. Okay.
just see what happened here. Right. Is it better there?
Great.
Okay. All right. So the presentation that I have this evening is on wastewater disinfection. Wastewater pathogens. So I'll just go right to the meat of it. Wastewater has several disease-causing organisms that can be detrimental to the health of humans and livestock. WHO has compiled a list of pathogens, and we classify them in 3 risk areas. High risk as helminths, lower risk as bacteria, those causing cholera, typhoid, shigellosis, and some protozoa, and the least risks are viruses. Right now, this is WHO characteristics, and it is based on the infection and the resistance of the organism to treatment. So, in terms of the indicative, the indicative levels of the organism, you have a list of the pathogen and the type of disease and the levels, and also what the dose is. So as you can see, the higher organisms in the higher life organisms, the infectious dose is much smaller, but it can be detrimental to both humans and animals. The performance objectives of wastewater disinfection should be to reduce the population of the microbes to below or at least meet the criteria of the environmental regulations of the country, state, as it might be. It should not result in increase in the toxicity of the wastewater, the discharge toxicity. But that is the whole purpose of wastewater treatment, to treat the water so it's less toxic to the environment. It should be reliable and it should be cost effective. And it should not result in any incremental risk to the environment due to its handling or storage. The disinfectant should be effective in killing the organism. It should be cheap, readily available. It should be safe, easy to apply, and it should not make water toxic. Now, there's a big difference between disinfection and sterilization. And some people might go with the concept that when you apply a disinfectant, you get a total kill. That is not so, right? So I will focus on two streams of disinfectants that are used today, most commonly in our part of the world: chlorination in its forms and UV radiation. Right? So chlorine, widely used, very effective at a low concentration, it's cheap, relative. It can form a residual, and it is applied based on health and safety principles, at least here in Trinidad and Tobago, as hypochlorite or bleach. We have veered away for using gas as the disinfectant, chlorine gas, because of its health and safety reasons. Right? So most common, if we're doing chlorination, we would look at using bleach or hypochlorite. Why chlorine? It is a strong oxidizing agent. It oxidizes the enzymes of the microbial cells that are necessary for the processes of the cells, the living processes, therefore it inactivates the cells. And it is by this principle, because people ask, why is chlorine, how does it work? Chlorine inactivates microbes by damaging the membrane. Once the cell is weakened, the chlorine enters the cell and stops the respiration. When enzymes come in contact with chlorine, you have substitution. And as a consequence, the enzyme does not function properly. And all living cells require enzymes to function properly. So if the enzymes do not function, then the cell eventually dies. So this principle is well thought of in the literature and highly explained. Many papers written by this. So we accepted that this is how chlorine works. And to further go into it, you look at the chemistry of chlorination. When you add chlorine to water, you get hypochlorous acid and HCl. The hypochlorous acid dissociates into hypochlorite ions and hydroxyonium ions based on the pH. Hypochlorous acid is 80 times more an effective disinfectant than the hypochlorite ions. But hypochlorous acid is dependent on the pH of the solution. So at this graph here, it tells you that if you put chlorine in water, based on the pH value, if the pH is around 6, and at 20 degrees, you have at least 90% or close to 100% available chlorine. If the pH, however, is 10 at the same temperature range, then you have very little concentration of hypochlorous acid. So in water treatment, I always advise people that the treatment process, if you want to save your chlorine and you want to save it, you have to use pH enhancement. It should be done after disinfection and not the other way around. Right? So it's important to know that. So at a pH 5, less than 5, you have molecular chlorine. At 5 to 10, you have both hypochlorite and hypochlorous acid present. And at a pH of 10, only hypochlorite is present. Right? And if you want to prevent the ionization of hypochlorous acid, it should be at a pH of 7. Now that is not always possible based on the conditions of the treatment system. So we see how that affects the disinfection as you go along. When you add chlorine to water, it is an oxidizing agent. So it reacts with organics and inorganics in the water and oxidizes them. The amount of this chlorine used is known as the demand. The remaining chlorine will appear as a residual chlorine. And this will serve to kill the pathogens which exist. So mostly you have to use up the demand and then have a residual for you to be safe or sure that you are on the way to disinfecting. Now, in the streams of wastewater treatment, the most effective wastewater treatment today, the technology, is variations of the activated sludge process. Because you have that process, you can withdraw at least 98, 96, 98% available BOD. And if you remove such an amount of BOD, then what is left, the organic constituents, it is hardly any much more left for reaction to cause a demand. So when we look at the dose based on scientific experiments and actual experiments carried on plants, like myself in the industry here in WaSA, we would have determined that based on the level of treatment activity sludge extended aeration, you would need between a demand at 2 to 6 milligrams of chlorine dosing before you get a residual. So if you run a treatment plant, whether it be an on-site treatment plant or a municipal plant, and you want to know how much chlorine to dose, you should run a chlorine demand test. And that is pretty straightforward to do. You take samples of the effluent, 1 liter samples, add varying amount of chlorine into it, put it in a closed cupboard for 30 minutes. And after that 30 minutes, you record the residuals. And the first one that gives you a residual is based on how much you added. You would know that is the demand for the particular sample. Right? So operators can do this simple test, but if you have lab facilities, it can be done more on a clinical scale, but more or less is the same procedure. The concept of contact time. All disinfectants work based on dose and contact time. Chlorine requires at least some trains are taught will tell you 15 minutes, some will say 30 minutes, right? But with chlorine, you can, because it's contact time and dose, you can vary one to the other. So you can have a high dose and a short contact time, which is not advisable, but in some cases, you can't do anything about that. So you have to utilize what you have. But the concept is you must have a detention time, and it must, the tank that you're using where you put in the disinfectant, it must be baffled to minimize short circuiting. Right? And if you want to reduce the time, you either remove the baffles, or if you want to increase and make sure it's effective, you increase the baffles. So you increase the contact time. I've seen many tanks back here in Trinidad and Tobago where people do not understand this concept. So they build a tank and they say they add chlorine to it, and there are no baffles. So what you get is a short circuiting once the tank is filled. I will finish the presentation and then I could field your questions after. But if anybody has a question, they can indicate so that I can address it. Right? So more or less, chlorine is well understood. Trinidad and the Caribbean is the disinfectant. We have the sodium hypochlorite, which is a 10% commercial strength bleach, or you could get a 12%, or you can get 5%, 5.5%, which is in normal bleach. And you can disinfect your wastewater with that. The volumes, however, it has to be calculated. If you use calcium hypochlorite, HTH, high test hypochlorite, we normally will use, that has a particular strength, at least here in Trinidad and Tobago, between 65 and 68% free available chlorine. It has to be dissolved and before it is usable. So you actually use the solution. The downside of that is that if you use an hypochlorite HTH, you have to have 2 dosing tanks. One a make down tank and then feed into the actual dosing tank. And you can have it either controlled by a float to have a constant level using a drip, or you have patented systems by manufacturers such as AccuTab, where you have a dosing pump attached. It's a patented skid that they have. You can have a dosing pump attached where you can reduce or increase the volume of disinfectant that you require. Right? So chlorine is well understood, and it's how to put it. It might be affordable in some instances and easier to operate. Just understand the chemistry. What is new for us? Well, new relatively, I would say, in the last 15 years here in Trinidad and Tobago, is the disinfection of wastewater by UV means. UV radiation is natural radiation from by the sun. Right? So natural wastewater treatment is by UV radiation. And they ask how, or the question arises, how does UV inactivate these organisms? Well, it's on the screen here. The organisms are inactivated when UV light is absorbed, because UV light interferes or changes the genetic makeup of the cell. It affects the DNA. So as the DNA is affected, modified by this UV radiation, it cannot replicate. So it is incapable of infecting a host. The shortcomings of it is that it does not leave a residual, but you have the upside of it in that the systems for dosing is not as rigorous as the chlorine. So you see that as you go along. Some of the advantages, it doesn't use any chemicals. The microorganisms, generally the lower class of the organisms, are made inactive by the UV radiation. Right? It is effective in inactivating cryptosporidium, right? Which can be problematic. It is used in air and water purification, sewage treatment. And one major advantage why people tend to go for UV is that it is capable of disinfecting the water faster than chlorine without the need for retention tanks. And it can reduce the level of indicative bacteria very effectively in terms of log time concentrations. So this is how it happens. So you have the DNA molecule. UV radiation disrupts the gene makeup of the cell, and it prevents the organism from replicating. UV radiation, I've put a graph here. So it occurs between, let's say, 200 and 315 nanometers. Between 200 to 280 is germicidal in property. Above 280, you get suntan burn. And if you get over 315, you get tan. For effective disinfection, we require between 250 and 270 nanometers. So normally in the industry, you see manufacturers, when you look at the spec sheet, you will see that their lamps are designed most times to operate at 264 nanometers. In terms of terminology for UV, again, it's the same concept. The dose is intensity by time. So the intensity refers to the strength of the current applied to the tube. And another thing when we talk about UV, which is not so much applied to when we speak about chlorine as its disinfectant, is the log inactivation. Remember, disinfection, especially by UV, is an inactivation of the cell. So you hear it referred to as 1 log, 2 log, 3 log, or 4 log disinfection. So the average person, when you hear that, they probably don't understand what it means. So I've put a slide here. So if you have 1,000, 100,000 bacteria, and it is said that well-treated wastewater would have E. coli of our 100,000 after all the treatment processes, the physical treatment processes. So we use this example. If you have 100,000, after 1 log, you have by 90%, and so on and so on. So normally UV systems are designed for having 4 log kill. So it reduces the 100,000 colony of bacteria to 100 bacteria. And if you look at least the environmental management rules in Trinidad and Tobago, our schedule for the water pollution rules with respect to E. coli bacteria is 400 colonies, except for environmentally sensitive areas where it is between 200 and 100 colonies. So when we talk about that, indirectly we're telling you that your UV system must be designed to have 4 log kill. So you're reducing 99.9% of the bacteria in the sample. Right? And the note below tells you otherwise in terms if you use a 2 log as a 4 log, what happens in terms of the pathogens. So this is important in when you size a UV system, you understand the concentration that you're being generated at and what is the capability. So these are questions that when the equipment suppliers are doing their sales pitch that you should ask. So normal disinfection by UV is 40 millijoules per centimeter squared. And at that rate, it can eliminate all the organisms that you are seeing there. Right? So it's very effective. Downside of UV, however, it doesn't leave a residual. So if you look at a simple pictorial, you will see if you're using UV, right? Cryptosporidium and bacteria, very effective. But if it's a virus, it is not effective. On the other hand, the converse is for chlorine. If you're using chlorine, bacteria and viruses are easy to inactivate, and protozoa is not. So the choice really is in terms of the environmental regulations or what you're hoping to achieve. The reactor vessel for the UV system can be inline, meaning within a pipe. It can be within a channel that you have the lamps immersed in this channel and the water flows around it, but the principle, the pictorial representation is the same here. Right? So you have an electrode with a lamp, the vessel, and you have water passing through the vessel over a particular time. At the Beetham wastewater treatment plant, where we have UV, what happens is that we have a modulating wear on the outfall. And based on the flow levels that coming in, ultrasonic controls modulate this wear so you can raise or lower so that you have a constant flow of water through the chamber. Right? Now, if it's a simple in-pipe system, it's regulated based on the flow requirements that the manufacturer would have given. And UV systems, if you're looking at wastewater design, are always supposed to be designed for peak flows. That is something that most consultants do not always take into consideration. Right? The output of the lamps, you hear people talk about low pressure and medium pressure. It depends on the energy requirement. Low pressure requires less energy. Medium pressure requires more energy. What does that relate to? It relates to the lamp age. So for a low pressure lamp, the age could be longer than a medium pressure lamp. So at the Beetham wastewater treatment plant, we have medium pressure lamps. And it is advisable that these lamps will have a working life of 2 years or otherwise based on the quality of water. So if you're sizing your system, generally small wastewater treatment systems will use low pressure lamps and large wastewater treatment plants will use medium pressure. When we consider large, is all relative here in Trinidad and Tobago, because we will consider the large being anything like over 4,000 meter cube per day. That, because of our size of facilities, that might not be so large as compared to in the North American syndrome. Beetham
control and flipping in Erie Canal at Northwest 168 Terrace and 17th Avenue in Northwest.
Okay. The Beetham wastewater treatment plant is capable of treating up to 40 million liters per day. And we use medium pressure UV lamps in that scenario. Okay, so I'll just load over the benefits of UV in terms of cryptosporidium, no formation of THMs or disinfection byproducts, small space requirements, and very competitive costs if we consider things like ozone or membrane filtration. Of course, I didn't consider chlorine. Of course, chlorine is the cheapest. What are some of the limitations? Well, odor control doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't remove color. It doesn't oxidize any metals. And it doesn't have any residual disinfectant capabilities. So what are the considerations for water quality in a treatment plant that you will have with UV? You have turbidity being a factor, so suspended solids. If you have suspended solids greater than what the environmental regulation will say, which is for our part of in Trinidad and Tobago is 50 milligrams per liter. Some countries have it at 30 milligrams per liter. UV would be a challenge for that scenario. If you have metals or colored wastewater, it presents a challenge and the bulbs become foul. At the Beetham wastewater treatment plant, when it was conceptualized, it was supposed to have treated the effluent from Angostura Rum Distillery. Now that is distillery effluent that is highly colored. when we put in the disinfectant into the plant and attempted to run it, the UV system became very, how to put it, was very compromised in that the fecal coliform level was not affecting at all. So even any small concentrations of color in terms of Hazen units, anything over 50 Hazen units, it compromises the effectiveness of the UV system. Right? So points to consider. UV transmittance, and we have that, the light source to the detector. And that is important to be able to know what is your transmittance capability for this system. Right, so we have the transmittance is determined by the distance from the lamp to the system to where the water is. So for the larger systems, it is wise to employ them within the chamber. So you have closest as possible to it. This is what a foul UV tubes look like. This is what we would routinely encompass, see at our beta wastewater treatment plant if we do not do proper preventative maintenance. Now, the lamp is inside here. This is the tube. So if this tube is fouled, obviously the effectiveness of the light reduces. Some systems now come with automatic wipers that will clean off most of the stuff, but it is not totally effective in that it can replace it and bring it back to the conditions when it was new. If you want to clean this tube properly, then you have to take out the tube and in most cases acid wash it in order to remove this fouled material. Right? Fouling. What does it do? What it can be a problem? Right? Got the same problem with turbidity. So before, traditionally, I would have advised people here in Trinidad where we have lagoons, whether it be waste stabilization ponds or aerated lagoons, is that UV should not be used because the fact that you have a lot of microscopic algae that causes the UV to be ineffective. Somebody asked me recently, well, why? How can you? So I sent it, how can UV be used in a situation where you have a lagoon and it's functioning properly? So did some checks, asked people in the industry outside of Trinidad and Tobago, and they said that if you employ microfilters, then UV becomes much more effective. So at the newly being constructed San Fernando wastewater treatment facility in South Trinidad, we have microfiltration before the UV radiation. So the effectiveness is much more than we would have had at the beta wastewater treatment plant. So turbidity is removed. The microfilters also removes a lot of the color, if the residual color, from the wastewater. So what you have is a very clear effluent going for disinfection. What are some of the take-home messages from this? Is that it's very effective, but it doesn't solve everything. It handles bacteria at the normally applied doses. But if you need to inactivate viruses, based on the chart that I showed, you may have to have a higher dose. It is not install and forget technology, as has happened in many small installations in Trinidad and Tobago. What happens if you use UV for an installation, especially a small installation? Majority of our small treatment systems use either the Salco 3G UV system or the Norweco 1580 systems, right? These are designed for handling 3 gallons per minute flow, very small, but people install them and forget about them. These things require some maintenance on a routine basis, either at a 3-month or 6-month level, because UV systems such as these do not come with automatic wipers, and you have to frequently clean the tube to make it effective. So if you install this in a grocery, in a school, in a police station, and you leave it for a year, after a year is no good, because once the tube is fouled, it sends back a signal and then the controls short out and then the system is rendered inactive. So it is not something that you install and forget. It needs some maintenance. The water quality, as indicated, the higher the degree of treatment, the more effective it is. And if you require to be using the water, let's say for reuse purposes, you want to reuse the effluent, you may need to use some post-treatment of chlorination to give you a factor of safety, right? That is my end of my presentation, and I will take your questions now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benny. I don't know if anyone in the chat, I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but feel free if you have some questions, please proceed.
I have a question. In Trinidad, are you using UV without chlorine?
Yes, in most instances, yes.
Oh, that's interesting, because normally I work most of the year in Canada, and they will use UV as a secondary treatment, but chlorine is almost always the first treatment.
No, we're talking wastewater here. We're dealing with wastewater, right?
Okay, okay.
Yeah, no, we normally would not use chlorine and then UV. It's either one or the other.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not a technical person, so I'm just trying to learn.
All right, okay. Well, some of the things on the presentation was geared for different audiences. So
Yeah.
in terms of the mechanism of UV and chlorination, because people want to know, how does it work?
Yeah, yeah. And are you doing any wastewater reuse?
We have planned to do for Port of Spain and San Fernando. Right now, San Fernando, because of the higher quality of effluent being produced, we are looking to, at least in the first stage, use this for agricultural purposes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I think this session would be very useful for a lot of our folks involved in the wastewater, wastewater treatment, and those who are doing revisions for the exams. So that's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it's comprehensive, and you know, Jean, I have level 4 certification, have had level 4 certification for some time.
Yeah.
So it is very useful for them because some of the questions come on that.
Yeah.
All right. So any further questions?
I don't see any others. If there are not, I know that you, Mr. Benny, has to catch up with another class. So I don't want to detain him here for much longer, but we'd like to thank you very much, David, for this excellent presentation. Of course, we have recorded it and it will be available to those who may have missed it, and those who are preparing for exams, they can find it on our YouTube site for revision.
All right. One before I go, John, my email You can share my email.
Yes, I will do.
Right. So if people have any further questions, I can respond to them.
All right, brilliant.
Okay. So thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, this is webinar number 14. Thank you all for joining, and we will see next week. Next week, I may not be joining you myself, but Susan will be taking over from me because I will be away on an assignment. So you have a good evening, and thank you for joining.
Okay,
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Val. I'll chat with you after, Valerie. I'll call
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Okay.